10 Tales of Christmas, Chapter 7 The Christmas Horses. Thanksgiving was past, and it was time to think of Christmas. Still, there was no snow and no rain. The sky was gray, and the prairie was dull, and the winds were cold. But the cold winds blew over the top of the dugout. Laura and Mary knew that Santa Claus could not come down a chimney when there was no chimney. One day, Mary asked Ma how Santa Claus could come. Ma did not answer. Instead, she asked, "What do you girls want for Christmas?" She was ironing. One end of the ironing board was on the table, and the other was on the bedstead. Pa had made the bedstead that high on purpose. Carrie was playing on the bed, and Laura and Mary sat at the table. Mary was sorting quilt blocks, and Laura was making a little apron for the rag doll Charlotte. The wind howled overhead and whined in the stovepipe, but there was no snow yet. Laura said, "I want candy." "So do I," said Mary, and Carrie cried, "Candy?" "And a new winter dress, and a coat, and a hood," said Mary. "So do I," said Laura, "and a dress for Charlotte, and—" Ma lifted the iron from the stove and held it out to them. They could test the iron. They licked their fingers and touched them quicker than quick to the smooth, hot bottom. If it crackled, the iron was hot enough. "Thank you," Mary and Laura, Ma said. She began carefully ironing around and over the patches on Pa's shirt. "Do you know what Pa wants for Christmas?" They did not know. "Horses," Ma said. "Would you girls like horses?" Laura and Mary looked at each other. "I only thought," Ma went on, "that if we all wished for horses, and nothing but horses, then maybe—" Laura felt queer. Horses were every day. They were not Christmas. If Pa got horses, he would trade for them. Laura could not think of Santa Claus and horses at the same time. "Ma," she cried, "there is a Santa Claus, isn't there?" "Of course there's a Santa Claus," said Ma. She set the iron on the stove to heat again. "The older you are, the more you know about Santa Claus," she said. "You are so big now, you know he can't be just one man, don't you? You know he is everywhere on Christmas Eve. He is in the big woods and in Indian Territory and far away in York State and here. He comes down all the chimneys at the same time. You know that, don't you?" "Yes, Ma," says Mary and Laura. "Well," said Mom, "then you see, I guess he is like angels," Mary said slowly, and Laura could see that just as well as Mary could. Then Ma told them something about Santa Claus. He was everywhere, and besides that, he was all the time. Wherever anyone was unselfish, that was Santa Claus. Christmas Eve was the time when everybody was unselfish. On that one night, Santa Claus was everywhere because everybody altogether stopped being selfish and wanted other people to be happy. And in the morning, you saw what that had done. If everybody wanted everybody else to be all happy all the time, then wouldn't it be Christmas all the time? Laura asked, and Ma said, "Yes, Laura." Laura thought about that, and so did Mary. They thought, and they looked at each other, and they knew what Ma wanted them to do. She wanted them to wish for nothing but horses for Pa. They looked at each other again, and they looked away quickly, and they did not say anything. Even Mary, who was always so good, did not say a word. That night after supper, Pa drew Laura and Mary close to him in the crook of his arms. Laura looked up at his face, and then she snuggled against him and said, "Pa." "What is it, little half-pint of sweet cider?" Pa asked. And Laura said, "Pa, I want Santa Claus to bring—" "What?" Pa asked. "Horses," said Laura, "if you will let me ride them sometimes." "So do I," said Mary, but Laura had said it first. Pa was surprised. His eyes shone soft and bright at them. "Would you girls really like horses?" he asked them. "Oh, yes, Pa," they said. "In that case," said Pa, smiling, "I have an idea that Santa Claus will bring us all a fine team of horses." That settled it. They would not have any Christmas, only horses. Laura and Mary soberly undressed and soberly buttoned up their nightgowns and tied their nightcap strings. They knelt down together and said, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. And please bless Ma and Pa and Carrie and everybody and make me a good girl forever and ever. Amen." Quickly Laura added in her own head, "And please make me only glad about the Christmas horses, forever and ever. Amen again." She climbed into bed, and almost right away she was glad. She thought of the horses sleek and shining, and how their manes and tails blew in the wind, how they picked up their swift feet and sniffed the air with velvety noses, and looked at everything with bright, soft eyes, and Pa would let her ride them. Pa had tuned his fiddle, and now he set it against his shoulder. Overhead, the wind went wailing lonely in the cold dark, but in the dugout, everything was snug and cozy. Bits of firelight came through the seams of the stove and twinkled on Ma's steel knitting needles and tried to catch Pa's elbow. In the shadows, the bow was dancing, and on the floor, Pa's toe was tapping, and the merry music hid the lonely crying of the wind. Next morning, snow was in the air. Hard bits of snow were leaping and whirling in the howling wind. Laura could not go out to play. In the stable, Spot and Pete and Bright stood out all day long, eating the hay and straw. In the dugout, Pa mended his boots while Ma ran to him. Again, the story called Millbank. Mary sewed, and Laura played with paper dolls. She could let Carrie hold Charlotte, but Carrie was too little to play with paper dolls. She might tear one. That afternoon, when Carrie was asleep, Ma beckoned Mary and Laura. Her face was shining with a secret. They put their heads close to hers, and she told them they could make a button string for Carrie's Christmas. They climbed onto their bed and turned their backs to Carrie and spread their laps wide. Ma brought them her button box. The box was almost full. Ma had saved buttons since she was smaller than Laura, and she had buttons her mother had saved when her mother was a little girl. There were blue buttons and red buttons and silvery and goldy buttons, curved-in buttons with tiny raised castles and bridges and trees on them, and twinkling jet buttons, painted china buttons, striped buttons, buttons like juicy blackberries, and even one tiny dog head button. Laura squealed when she saw it. Shh! Ma shushed her, but Carrie did not wake up. Ma gave them all those buttons to make a button string for Carrie. After that, Laura did not mind staying in the dugout. When she saw the outdoors, the wind was driving snow drifts across the bare, frozen land. The creek was ice and the willow tops rattled. In the dugout, she and Mary had their secret. They played gently with Carrie and gave her everything she wanted. They cuddled her and sang to her and got her to sleep whenever they could. Then they worked on the button string. Mary had one end of the string and Laura had the other. They picked out the buttons they wanted and strung them on the string. They held the string out and looked at it, took off some buttons and put on others. Sometimes they took every button off and started again. They were going to make the most beautiful button string in the world. One day, Ma told them that this was the day before Christmas. They must finish the button string that day. They could not get Carrie to sleep. She ran and shouted, climbed on benches and jumped off, and skipped and sang. She did not get tired. Mary told her to sit still like a little lady, but she wouldn't. Laura let her hold Charlotte, and she jounced Charlotte up and down and flung her against the wall. Finally, Ma cuddled her and sang. Laura and Mary were perfectly still. Lower and lower, Ma sang, and Carrie's eyes blinked till they were shut. When softly Ma stopped singing, Carrie's eyes poked open, and she shouted, "More, Mom, more!" But at last she fell asleep. Then quickly, Laura and Mary finished the button string. Ma tied the ends together for them. It was done, and they could not change one button more. It was a beautiful button string. That evening after supper, when Carrie was sound asleep, Ma hung her clean little pair of stockings from the table edge. Laura and Mary, in their nightgowns, slid the button string into one stocking. Then that was all. Mary and Laura were going to bed when Pa asked them, "Aren't you girls going to hang your stockings?" "But I thought," Laura said, "I thought Santa Claus was going to bring us horses." "Maybe he will," said Pa, "but little girls always hang up their stockings on Christmas Eve, don't they?" Laura did not know what to think. Neither did Mary. Ma took 2 clean stockings out of the clothes box, and Pa helped hang them beside Carrie's. Laura and Mary said their prayers and went to sleep, wondering. In the morning, Laura heard the fire crackling. She opened one eye the least bit and saw a lamplight and a bulge in her Christmas stocking. She yelled and jumped out of bed. Mary came running too, and Carrie woke up. In Laura's stocking and in Mary's stockings, there were little paper packages just alike. In the packages was candy. Laura had 6 pieces, and Mary had 6. They had never seen such beautiful candy. It was too beautiful to eat. Some pieces were like ribbons bent in waves. Some were short bits of round stick candy, and on their flat ends were colored flowers that went all the way through. Some were perfectly round and striped. In one of Carrie's stockings were 4 pieces of that beautiful candy. In the other was the button string. Carrie's eyes and her mouth were perfectly round when she saw it. Then she squealed and grabbed it and squealed again. She sat on Pa's knee looking at her candy and her button string and wiggling and laughing with joy. Then it was time for Pa to do the chores. He said, "Do you suppose there's anything for us in the stable?" And Ma said, "Dress as fast as you can, girls, and you can go to the stable and see what Pa finds." It was winter, so they had to put on stockings and shoes. But Ma helped them button up the shoes, and she pinned their shawls under their chins. They ran out into the cold. Everything was gray except a long red streak in the eastern sky. Its red light shone on the patches of gray-white snow. Snow was caught in the dead grass on the walls and the roof of the stable, and it was red. Pa stood waiting on the stable door. He laughed when he saw Laura and Mary, and he stepped outside to let them go in. There, standing in Pete's and Bright's places, were 2 horses. They were larger than Pet and Patty, and they were a soft red-brown color, shining like silk. Their manes and tails were black. Their eyes were bright and gentle. They put their velvety noses down to Laura and nibbled softly at her hand and breathed warm on it. "Well, Flutterbudget," said Pa, and Mary, "how do you girls like your Christmas?" "Very much, Pa," said Mary, but Laura could only say, "Oh, Pa." Pa's eyes shone deep, and he asked, "Who wants to ride the Christmas horses to water?" Laura could hardly wait while he lifted Mary up and showed her how to hold on to the mane and told her not to be afraid. And then Pa's strong hand swung Laura up. She sat on the horse's big, gentle back and felt its aliveness carrying her. All outdoors was glittering now with sunshine on snow and frost. Pa went ahead, leading the horses and carrying his axe to break the ice in the creek so they could drink. The horses lifted their heads and took deep breaths and whooshed the cold out of their noses. Their velvety ears pricked forward and then back and forward again. Laura held to her horse's mane and clapped her shoes together and laughed. Pa and the horses and Mary and Laura were all happy in the gay, cold Christmas morning. By Laura Ingalls Wilder.